Great.
There's Emily.
Okay, I think we're ready to start, and now we'll start. So welcome to today's video conference, the 15th in our series of weekly briefings to help reporters track the COVID-19 pandemic and the racial and economic inequities it is exposing and exacerbating in our country. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Today, our focus is on what many experts predict will be a tsunami of evictions nationwide over coming months, as millions of laid-off workers are unable to pay rent and eviction moratoriums are set to expire by the end of July. On behalf of EMS, I want to extend our thanks to Blue Shield of California Foundation and the California Healthcare Foundation for their support of this initiative. A special thanks also to today's speakers and to veteran reporters Pilar Marrero and Sunita Sarabji for coordinating the project. A special thanks also to all of you, our colleagues in the media sector who regularly cover these conferences. A note to our regulars, Dr. Tung Nguyen is unable to join today's conference with his weekly update on the pandemic. He's become an indispensable resource for us, and we look forward to his summaries on future calls. Jessica Martin will now offer instructions on how to enter questions for the speakers in our chat box. We will be inviting questions at the conclusion of each speaker and end the conference with at least 10 minutes for additional Q&A. Here's Jessica.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining our briefing. So to access the chat box, if you're joining by laptop, there'll be a bar at the bottom of your screen with a bunch of icons. You want to click the chat icon, and then you also want to chat with everyone so that we can see your messages. If you are joining by cell phone, smart cell phone, there is 3 dots on the right-hand side where it says click more. You want to click there, and that is where the chat function is. If you are purely dialing in, there's no video, you can't use the chat function, but you can submit questions via the emails on the invite that's listed under contacts. And again, please message with everyone so we can see your questions and open the dialogue.
Thank you. And we will be sending a video of this conference to all our attendees, along with any of the collateral reports that our speakers reference this afternoon. So with that, I turn the conference over to our moderator, Sunita Sarabji.
Good morning, everyone. Going very quickly, I would like to introduce you to our first speaker, Emily Benfer. She is a visiting professor at Wake Forest University School of Law. Emily, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I do have slides. I'm not sure if those came through or not. I can go ahead without them if that's better. Go for it. Okay. All right.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. And I can send slides as a follow-up to everyone who's listening if that would be helpful, so you have the data readily available.
Perfect.
Great. To begin, at a time when sheltering in place is paramount to stabilizing the United States and controlling the pandemic, our country is on the brink of a housing crisis of unprecedented magnitude and with no safety net beneath us. COVID-19 struck at a time when we were already at a housing crisis. 20.5 million families struggled to scrape the rent together, and only 1 in 4, so 25% of eligible renters actually received federal financial assistance, and they were eligible. That means that many people did not qualify for or did not receive housing subsidies even though they were qualified. So between the scarcity of federal housing assistance and the loss of 4 million affordable housing units over the last decade, renters were increasingly vulnerable to eviction coming into the pandemic. To put this in perspective, 7 evictions were filed every minute in 2016. That was when the average national unemployment rate was 4.7%. Today, as you know, unemployment is nearly 4 times that level and expected to keep fluctuating upwards. So why can we expect eviction to increase? Underscoring the immense toll of the pandemic, 50 million renters today live in households that suffered COVID-19 related job loss or income loss. and 40% of that occurred in especially low-income households. In addition, the demand for financial assistance is at an all-time high. There was a 92% increase in daily rental assistance requests from this time last year, and programs are being exhausted within minutes of being opened for rental assistance. In addition, food pantry requests have increased by as much as 2,000% in some states. So this demonstrates that renters are really stretched to pay the rent first, and other things are being set aside like food, necessities, healthcare, and otherwise. Renters are also taking on credit card and loan debt just to make ends meet and pay the rent. A new analysis of the US Census House Pulse Survey by Stout, Reeses, and Ross that came out today estimates that approximately 16.9 million households, many of which contain numerous adults and children, are unable to pay the rent and at risk of eviction. Another study by the Aspen Institute found that 20 to 24 million renters will be facing eviction by the end of September. So again, to put this in perspective, 10 million people were displaced from their homes over a course of years following the foreclosure crisis of 2008. We are on track to surpass that number in just 4 months. Renters of color, especially Black and Latinx renters, are at the highest risk. These populations have experienced COVID-19 job loss, infection, and death at much higher rates than other demographics, and they consistently report low confidence in their ability to pay the rent during this pandemic. The steep decline in rent payments will also have a devastating impact across the housing market, especially among small property owners who lack the financial ability to sustain short and long-term non-payment of rent. Individual investors, so small property owners, own approximately 22.7 million out of the 48.5 million rental units in the country. The Harvard University Joint Center on Housing Studies estimates that 20% of renters in these units may have difficulty paying the rent. These are the types of units that we will lose in the housing market that will decrease affordable housing and end up crippling that entire system, depleting it as well. In response to the increasing risk of eviction, state and local governments issued moratoriums, and the federal government passed the CARES Act, which created a moratorium on federally assisted housing and also had temporary unemployment insurance. These prevented widespread eviction between March and July, but these are also expiring at the end of July, along with the majority of state-issued moratoriums. And this is before states have developed and implemented strategies to really support property owners and renters to weather this storm. So today, less than half of the states have a state-level eviction moratorium, and 29 states received less than 1 out of 5 stars on the housing policy scorecard that I created with the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. This means that evictions that were on hold will be executed and new evictions will be filed. Michigan's moratorium, for example, expired this week, and they expect 80,000 eviction filings now. The majority of courts have moved to remote hearings, which also raises questions about a tenant's ability to exercise their right to be heard. Between the technology divide, the lack of minutes on their phone, the ability to pay for their phone or access a computer when they can't pay the rent, as well as language barriers and others, create significant due process concerns. So what does this mean for renters and for society? Well, eviction has negative consequences that result in high community and healthcare expenditures. Just the notice of eviction can increase rates of stress, anxiety, and depression. Renters with eviction filings on their record are often blocked out of the renter market by landlords, even if they ultimately won their case. Eviction results in failing credit scores. It forces families into rental housing with substandard conditions that pose a threat to their health and safety. And it almost always leads to a downward move to rundown housing, to disadvantaged higher crime neighborhoods, homelessness, academic decline. No good outcome from eviction. And these outcomes cost communities and taxpayers far more than the price of addressing the affordable housing crisis itself. In places like California, the risk of eviction has resulted in a rise in the creation of unions. Renters have started to protest, demanding cancel the rent or rent relief. And the formation of these tenant unions in buildings and communities was designed to really organize and increase tenant bargaining power. They have had early successes, including rent control ordinances. Ultimately, the pandemic magnified and heightened the socioeconomic divide and the health and racial disparities and shredded the already threadbare safety net in America. State leaders, federal leaders have an unparalleled opportunity to address these outcomes and their root causes, to ensure that the new post-pandemic reality is one in which health justice, racial justice, and housing justice are realized. And I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Emily. Could I start with a question for you? When we briefed, you had some demographic data on populations that are particularly vulnerable to eviction. I wonder if you could share some of your findings with us.
The demographic data related to minorities who are facing eviction?
Exactly.
Yes. So some of the statistics have demonstrated that there's a disproportionate impact on, many of the studies have demonstrated that there's a disproportionate impact on Black and Latinx renters who have experienced COVID-19 job or wage loss at much higher rates. In fact, Black renters experienced it at 44% and Hispanic at 61%, whereas white households were only a fraction of that at 38%. In addition, they also demonstrate a lack of emergency funds to cover 3 months of expenses. Nearly 75% of Black and Latino renters said that they did not have those emergency funds over 3 months, as compared to only 47% of white renters. And these trends have continued throughout the pandemic. And this is largely due to a longstanding loss of wealth accumulation and affordable housing throughout our history, especially due to discriminatory zoning laws and other policies that have really blocked communities of color out of that kind of forward movement. And they also lost all of the gains that they made in homeownership and other areas due to predatory lending and other outcomes of the 2008 foreclosure crisis.
Thank you. Henrietta Burrows has a very important question for you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarita. I am just wondering, in terms of those evicted, where will they be going, given the number of evictions that you're talking about? And also, given the market at this time, do the rental owners expect that they will be able to get tenants who can pay higher rents? Or will a lot of the apartments, rental places go vacant?
That's such a great question. So eviction often leads to housing instability and homelessness. And so families rarely are able to locate equal living situations. So they end up doubled up in overcrowded settings or in homeless shelters. And all of these are places where people cannot safely social distance, where there just isn't the space to do that. And we know that COVID-19, the risk of COVID-19 is related to contact. So the inability to social distance, to safely shelter in place, could expose families who are evicted to COVID-19 at higher rates and really spur an increase in that contraction rate. In terms of the property owners, so many of the property owners who will be affected by non-payment of rent are small property owners who don't have the financial cushion to wait for a new renter. And so what may happen is that the housing market itself will be depleted, and these units will actually be taken off the market or repurposed for something else, as opposed to being re-rented by a different tenant.
Interesting. Emily, thank you so much. Your comments are hugely informative.
Could I ask,
yes.
There's so many questions, this great opening address, but are there states that you see that are particularly hit hard that we should have on our radar? And are there states that are ahead of the curve, or even local areas ahead of the curve in addressing this? We have a national media audience.
Great. So the states that I'm really concerned about are the ones that have reported high levels of insecurity, so inability to pay their rent, and combined with very limited protections against eviction. So the moratoriums have already been lifted or expired, and the renters were already facing rent burden. So the states, a lot of the southern states fall into that category. I'm particularly concerned about Florida and Mississippi and Texas and those regions. Others are ones that you may not see a backlog of eviction filings right now because they accepted evictions and processed them and executed them throughout the pandemic. So states like Missouri or Ohio are very concerning because they're housing instability and the population affected by that has been increasing this entire time. So those are states that I'm especially concerned about. But truly, this issue is touching every corner of the country. No one has been spared from the economic depression and the result that that has, the effect that that has on housing and the subsequent impacts. So the states that have very little safety net in place for populations will have a very challenging time recovering from this, and will feel the effects through the societal costs and the impact to our communities.
Emily, thank you once again for your very insightful comments. I would like to next introduce Delegate Kumar Barve. Mr. Barve and his fellow legislators wrote a letter to Governor Larry Hogan asking to extend the state's eviction moratorium to January of 2021. Delegate Barve, welcome.
Great to be here. Let me just say that Governor Hogan was one of the few Republican governors to actually act decisively and crisply at the very beginning of this. He implemented by executive order our first eviction moratorium in mid-March. Also, we have had a moratorium on late fees and utility turnoffs. Now, my committee had a pretty extensive briefing where we invited all the stakeholders, tenant advocacy groups, the business community, the banking community, and we found that they were uncharacteristically united in their belief that more money had to be committed to rental assistance. We're a part-time legislature. We meet January through April. And so unless there's a special session, which we don't anticipate having, unless there's a special session, we're not going to be back in town in Annapolis until next January. So I and my vice chair, the vice chair of the committee that I'm the chairman of, wrote a letter to the governor, and we asked for the governor to extend the moratorium until January 31st, which would give us time to get back into session to work with the administration to craft a more permanent public policy response to the constellation of issues here. We emphasized the fact that we wanted a lot more money from the CARES Act to be dedicated to temporary rental assistance. And, the view that we take, that at least the majority of my committee members take and the Speaker of the House takes, is that, typically in Montgomery County, Maryland, where I live, maybe 1/4% to 1/2 of 1% of the population is evicted. If you up that to 10% or 15%, you suddenly have a problem that's not just falling within the dry confines of landlord-tenant contract law. What we're talking about in that instance would be a full-scale social disruption. I think from the perspective of landlords, it would be, most landlords, look, I mean, I know tenant advocates don't have this attitude. Most landlords have no interest in evicting people summarily. I mean, tenants who stay and pay is how they make their living. But this situation is going to catch a lot of property owners in a very tough situation. On the one hand, the minute you evict somebody, you're going to have to spend a lot of money to prepare the property for the next renter, if there is a next renter. And so it's our hope that we will work with the administration to craft a more permanent solution to this situation. For right now, though, everybody's on pins and needles. Nobody knows, there are so many unknowns. We don't know, what the budgetary numbers of revenues are going to be like for the state of Maryland between now and January. We don't know who the next president of the United States is going to be. That'll, of course, be determined in early November, and that would color a lot of our policy directions. So, I think right now what we need to do is we need to put the economy in stasis, if that's possible, to hit the pause button. I think it's important not just for tenants, but also for property owners and for small businesses who are right now worrying about being kicked out of their place of business as well. So this is a problem that if we allow a large proportion of the population to be evicted, we could have a revolution on our hands. I mean, I think it is not hyperbolic to look at it in those terms. And I'll close with one thing that I saw in the press. CNBC, which I've never thought of as being a particularly left-wing commercial organization, CNBC reported that early in the month of July, as many as 32% of the American public had not paid some or all of their rent. Now, if these folks start getting evicted in August and in September, the whole term rental tsunami, eviction tsunami is going to come true, and that's going to be a very ugly situation. And I'll just conclude by saying that, you know, even I'm a Democrat and I tend to be pretty liberal, but I'm also very pro-free market and I tend to be very pro-business. But this is not a business issue. This is a social welfare issue at this point, because evicting 10% of the population would be a humanitarian catastrophe, the likes of which would take us a very long time to recover from. So that's
Delegate
it.
Barve, does all the past due rent immediately come due in Maryland once the eviction moratorium is lifted?
Technically, yeah, but I mean, as a practical matter, landlords don't want to get rid of, I mean, look, let's say you're a landlord and you have a tenant who worked in a restaurant and she lost her job, and now it's August, she's got 4 months back rent, but she just got another job and she can document that she has a job. If you're a landlord, as a practical matter, you're going to try and work out a deal in most cases, because it's so much cheaper to keep somebody in an apartment renting. And so, yeah, technically they could be kicked out, but you know, given where the economy is right now, if you kick somebody out of an apartment unit, you're not absolutely assured that it's going to be filled immediately as you might have been a year ago. If you evict somebody in, you know, summer of 2019, you're going to fill that apartment pretty quickly. Today, not so much, probably.
Interesting. Fatme, I believe you had a question.
You got to unmute yourself.
Actually, okay. You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, actually, I just sent. We hear that the city of Los Angeles, they're opening an application for emergency. Application for emergency rental relief program, and it starts on the 13th. And it's closed on the 17th of July. And this application, it has a lot of restricted information for the people they're gonna apply. Also, it's not for everybody, it's just for randomly, they're gonna choose some people.
What state is this happening in?
It start July 13 and it's gonna close in July 17.
But in what state?
California.
Oh.
Los Angeles City. City of Los Angeles.
Kumar, that might be out of your purview. Fatme, he's Maryland based.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm in the state of Maryland.
Okay.
So let's take a question from Mariver Montalban. Mariver?
Hi, hello. Oh, I thought it was just going to be read. Thank you so much. I am from New York, but this goes to the federal government. My question: Will it help if the federal government would declare a moratorium for landlords to not be able to pay for real estate taxes and other financial obligations that they have, so that they don't need to exact rent from their tenants? Would that help? Is there a facility to do that?
No, because most landlord-tenant law is state law, and I don't think the federal government has the ability to legally micromanage state governments in that fashion. Now they do, you know, what they have had the ability to do, they've done. They've, through the CARES Act, they established a moratorium on foreclosures for federally backed mortgages. So they were able to do that. But really, the vast majority of the landlord-tenant laws in the United States are state law. And so I'm maybe the federal government can do this, but I'd be surprised if that were the case.
Could you stay on for two more very important questions?
Sure.
Thank you so much.
So the next question comes from Frank Blanquette.
Good. Am I?
Yes, you are.
We can hear you.
Oh, okay. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I have two questions. As it pertains to undocumented immigrants or migrant workers that are working in the agricultural trade via work visas, when these communities are facing eviction, but are also concerned with deportation or work revocation, are there resources specifically for these communities as they seek eviction help or relocation opportunities? And my other question is, are there government subsidies for renters? And if they do receive these subsidies, who makes sure that they don't still evict low-income renters?
Well, in the state of Maryland, my committee and the Democrats are committed to treating people equally regardless of what their documentation status is. We're very aware, in Maryland at least, of the fact that these workers, even if they are undocumented, are working in our communities and paying taxes. And so, at least with respect to my view of this in Maryland, we shouldn't be having separate treatment for these separate groups of people. I can't speak for the rest of the United States. And certainly when we begin to craft, by the way, there was some unanimity of opinion between the business community and the tenant advocacy community on this point in Maryland. Landlords, they're going to want rental assistance for all of their renters who are having difficulty, and I'm not sure they give a damn whether they're documented or not, certainly not in Maryland. And so, at least with respect to my point of view here in Maryland, I understand what you're saying exactly, but I mean, it's really very much on a state-by-state basis.
And finally, a question from Dipti Dawar.
Hi, Mr. Barbe, can you comment on some of the issues with regards to the gray area as it pertains to the hardship? When tenants are trying to establish their hardship and they're unable to come to an agreement with their landlords, what kind of services does Maryland offer to the tenants and the landlords in order to mediate and remedy the situation so that they are able to, I guess, not only address the eviction moratorium, because a lot of times the moratorium only helps you so far.
Right.
So how do you address the gray area?
Right, just to make it clear, in the state of Maryland, and I don't know how other states have done this, in the state of Maryland, in order to be eligible for an eviction moratorium, you have to be able to document in some way that your hardship is due to COVID-19. And so how do you do that? I mean, obviously filing for unemployment is a way. The testimony we got from the tenant advocates at our briefing was that at least up until now, the landlords have been cutting them a break. I mean, one person, for example, had a text message that they sent to a family member saying, "I just lost my job," and the landlord, decided to accept that as a legitimate. I mean, most landlords know who their tenants are, who've been paying regularly, and look, in every building there are one or two tenants who are not good tenants, and the landlords know who they are as well. But for the majority of these people, in the majority of these instances, according to the testimony we received so far from the tenant advocacy community, it seems that landlords have been pretty generous in establishing hardship in the hopes that when we begin to implement real rental assistance programs, which we really haven't yet in Maryland, that they will be able to get those renters qualified. Again, bear in mind, if you look at it exclusively from the economic standpoint of the landlord, documenting a person of hardship will probably be a long-term benefit to the landlord, because it would make that person and their rent eligible for whatever subsidy program is put together. Right now, though, I have to say, in the state of Maryland, we are woefully inadequate. And the reason for that is, for the most part, because our revenues have been our tax revenue base has been crashing because of the recession.
Absolutely. Delegate Barbe, thank you so much for joining us on this important briefing. We welcome your comments. And we move on to Dr. Margot Kuchel. She's a professor of medicine at UCSF and the director of the seminal Center for Vulnerable Populations at UCSF. Dr. Kuchel, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'd like to speak a little bit about the effects of the pending eviction crisis on homelessness. As you know, the homelessness crisis has been a crisis for a long time in the United States, and it's primarily a crisis that disproportionately impacts people of color, particularly Black Americans and Indigenous Americans, who are overrepresented in the homeless population by factors of 4 to 8. The homelessness crisis, while often portrayed as a crisis of mental health and substance use, is and has always been a crisis of the devastating lack of affordable housing, of the effects of structural racism, and of income inequality full scale. The COVID crisis has both increased the costs of homelessness, as you may have heard about devastating outbreaks of COVID in congregate shelters, of much more difficulties for people facing homelessness who are not in shelter because of closure of food programs and libraries and other places where people could seek some form of mild relief. And there has been some effort through the federal government to try to solve or bring resources to people currently experiencing homelessness. Many of us, including me, are extremely worried about the other problem and the feeling of that if we focus our efforts on homelessness on people who are currently homeless, it is like it is like trying to bail a leaking ship, because we know that we cannot solve homelessness merely by focusing on the people who are currently homeless. There are current estimates that there will be increases in homelessness on the order of 20 to 40% unless decisive action will be taken through the crises that we're talking about currently. What will happen to families and households when they become evicted? For many, as Emily Benfer noted, that people leave eviction and move to less stable housing. They double up with others. They enter into crowded households. But for many, they fall directly from eviction into homelessness. Or for others, they move into these overcrowded housing where things are unstable, and after a period of a year or two, they eventually fall into homelessness. This is where our concerns lie. Right now, what would happen if you became homeless is more complicated than it's ever been. In about 50% of Americans who are homeless are sheltered. On the West Coast, it's only about a third of people are in shelters when they're homeless. Homeless shelters have become decidedly more worrisome because of the impacts of COVID, and thus many places have really decreased access to shelter. So you see rises in unsheltered homelessness because of the difficulty of having shelters. We worry that there will be dramatic increases in unsheltered homelessness. There have been responses throughout, for instance, California has had a program called Project Room Key, which has provided hotel rooms to individuals who are particularly vulnerable to dying from COVID. This program, though, just to give you a sense of scale, has successfully placed about 15,000 homeless individuals into hotel rooms out of about 150,000 homeless people who already existed in California. The governor of California just announced Project Home Key, which will provide $600 million to try to acquire properties, many of these hotels that are currently being used to provide housing. But again, this will be a drop in the bucket for the people who are currently experiencing homelessness and will not address the new inflows into homelessness. What would it take to end homelessness in this country? It has to be a dramatic expansion of extremely low-income housing, as well as a dramatic expansion of rental support. There is the HEROES Act, which has passed the House but is being held up by the Senate, would provide dramatic rental relief funds, but it is not going through right now. Currently, pre-pandemic, only 1 in 4 households in this country who met the strict criteria for rental relief from the federal government received it because it is a limited resource. The cost to fully fund that is about $31 billion a year. We currently spend about $12 billion on shelter, but we leave most homeless people who are homeless unsheltered. Just again, give you a sense of scale. So I think, being that this is a problem that so disproportionately affects people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous Americans, we anticipate that the eviction crisis will disproportionately impact those communities as well. And we are anticipating at the very worst time we possibly could have dramatic increases in homelessness. I think you're on mute, Sunita.
Dr. Kushel, in our pre-brief, you had talked about the impact to children of being evicted, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Children, and I think Emily Benfer spoke about it. When children are evicted, they have severe, it causes disruptions in schooling and disruptions in education, mental health problems, et cetera. I will say that family homelessness and sort of the equivalent of homelessness in Latinx populations often looks a little different than it does for single adults, that families often will do everything that they can to avoid showing up in shelter systems or in unsheltered settings because children get removed from households. And so there's a little bit of a definitional issue here where many families who really would be homeless but are not counted as homeless because what they are is living in extraordinarily overcrowded housing situations because those families are doing everything that they can to avoid showing up in the homeless system because of the risk that the children will be removed from the families. We'll say that we are seeing this crisis of COVID very much disproportionately affecting, as you know, Black, Native, and Latinx households. And in Latinx communities, what we're seeing is extraordinary overcrowding of housing. 12 people sharing a room or a bathroom, which is obviously extremely dangerous for purposes of COVID, but may not be counted as homeless because they don't meet the federal definition of homelessness. We see that a lot with households with children, where they will, instead of sort of popping into the shelter system or into the streets, will instead have these extraordinarily overcrowded conditions, which are not safe for COVID, nor are they safe for mental health, emotional health, schooling, or any of the other issues.
Absolutely. Oni Advincula, you had a question.
Yes. We have been seeing a lot of workers who fled from their cities during this pandemic, especially when the cases of infection in these cities like New York in the beginning and now Florida, Texas, and Georgia are rising. Yeah. It is not only a matter of choice for them, but also safety. Absolutely. Since they have been working from home, essentially their apartments turn into an expensive storage. Yeah. What's the policy if they need to break the lease in the wake of the coronavirus?
The policy to break the lease, is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that is a very, I don't know that I know the answer to that, but I do think that really brings up the problem, right? That they're not abandoning leases for purposes of choice. They're abandoning it for, in order to save their lives. And I think that is really the heart of why we've been talking about COVID as this crisis within a crisis. We've had such a dire crisis of affordable housing for so long in this country. And that crisis is really, exactly what we can't tolerate with COVID, because it is in fact these crowded conditions, whether you're talking about a congregate shelter or whether you're talking about 3 households living in a 2-bedroom apartment, that really is really a life or death issue vis-a-vis COVID.
Absolutely. And Pilar has a very important question. Pilar Marrero.
Hi, hello. I'm wondering, because you mentioned the HEROES Act, that is stuck, and the Senate doesn't seem interested in taking it up, and the president is not talking about this anymore. So it's solved according to him. So do you see any proposals from the presidential candidates that could address this issue in a future administration? What can we expect if we have a President Biden?
I mean, I think that I'm heartened to see housing being coming onto the agenda in a way that I have not seen it under many other administrations, and to be honest, including Democratic candidates in the past. And that I think that the obviousness of this crisis has sort of increased interest, and I certainly see the Biden campaign is talking about things like the HEROES Act, really rental relief and a dramatic reinvestment in affordable housing. I mean, in this country right now, there are about 35 or 36 units of housing that are available and affordable for every 100 extremely low-income households. Extremely low-income households are households that make 30% or less of the area median income. When you talk about states like California, we're at 23 units per every 100 extremely low-income households. That is why we have the homelessness crisis. And so I think that there have been discussions of not only funding the voucher system, the rental relief, through housing choice vouchers, but also putting more money into the preservation and production and protection of deeply affordable housing.
Dr. Kushel, we have so many more questions for you, but I'm afraid we have to move on. To reporters, we will try to get your questions answered after the call. Thank you so much for your very insightful comments. And we move on to Nisha Vyas. She is the senior attorney at the Western Center for Law and Poverty. Nisha, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here today with all of you. Western Center on Law and Poverty advocates to secure access to housing, healthcare, and public benefits for low-income Californians. So I want to be very clear where this presentation is California specific, and I am a tenants' rights advocate. So we've talked about the looming eviction crisis as a tsunami, and that metaphor I think is intended to capture the magnitude of the crisis. But I want to be really clear that this is not a natural disaster. It will be a disaster of our own making. And the good news about that, though, is that there's nothing inevitable about this crisis. I think, like Emily alluded to earlier, to prevent it, we need to advocate for meaningful governmental intervention. And I won't say that that's easy, but it's something that's going to be necessary if we want to avoid the crisis that is coming towards us pretty fast and furious. So before I describe the current statewide eviction moratorium in California, I'm going to give you a brief background on evictions in California, and then I'll talk about the statewide policies that we're advocating for to prevent mass evictions as the unemployment rates continue to climb and more of California's estimated 17 million renters become unable to pay their rents. So in California, by law, landlords must go through a court process to evict tenants. The process is designed to be very efficient and really to provide consistent results for landlords to be able to eject tenants from and recover their properties. And there's often very little regard for outcome for the tenants. Eviction lawsuits are fast-tracked. Nearly 75% of eviction cases are resolved within 45 days of filing, and nearly 60% of those are resolved within 1 month. So I just want to highlight how quick they are. When a tenant is served with an eviction lawsuit, the tenant has only 5 days to file a response in court or risk losing their case and therefore their homes by default. So in the vast majority of eviction cases, landlords are represented by attorneys, and the vast majority of tenants are not represented. And because of this, even when a tenant has strong defenses to an eviction, if they don't have an attorney, they're more than likely going to lose their case. Now, because evictions proceed so quickly and there are so few resources for low-income tenants to get meaningful help when an eviction is filed, evictions have played a significant role in creating California's affordable housing crisis and our homelessness crisis. I know that you've heard statistics about this from the previous presenters, but before the pandemic, 8 out of 10 extremely low income households and over 5 out of 10 very low income renters were paying more than half their income in rent. Some say 90, some households paid 90% of their income towards rent. And communities of color disproportionately bear these crises, with Black, Latinx, and immigrant households significantly more rent burdened than white households. So even before COVID-19, people have been struggling to pay the rent and to stay housed in California. Now, the California Judicial Council, which is the body that regulates the court system in our state, adopted a temporary emergency rule on April 6th that effectively stops the courts from processing evictions during the state of emergency. There is related to COVID-19. There's a limited exception for cases in which courts make findings that there's a health and safety reason to proceed with the eviction, although those are rare. I want to note that the rule does not suspend the tenant obligation to pay rent. It is also temporary. The rule expires, by its own terms, the rule expires 3 months after the COVID-19 state of emergency ends. Hasn't ended yet in California, but the court officials have indicated that they could end it earlier than that. They could end it now if they wanted to. Meanwhile, as of April 1st, more than 80 California cities and counties have adopted tenant protections, including temporary bans on evictions. They're very unique to each city and county, and the details really vary. What's important to note is when that threshold of that floor for all Californians is lifted by the Judicial Council, then tenants are going to have to kind of navigate these additional tenant protections, based on what city or county that they live in. And a lot of they're, for the most part, going to need to go to court to show that these individual, the local protections apply to their particular circumstances. Now, despite the statewide moratorium and local tenant protections, we have heard reports of landlords still attempting to displace tenants from housing using a variety of methods, including calling the police, trying to trick tenants into leaving by serving them with papers that look like they've been issued by the court but haven't, or simply by changing the locks. I want to stress that all of these methods are illegal. And in the instance of calling the police on tenants, we're having a national conversation on the relationship between the police and communities of color, and particularly Black communities. So we can even, this behavior is actually dangerous in many instances. Now, landlord groups are also fighting, their associations are fighting eviction protections in court and have been attempting to challenge these rules. We're confident, though, that the emergency measures that the local governments and that the state court leaders have taken are necessary and reasonable in light of the pandemic. But we do need to think about what we need to do to help people stay in their homes when these temporary measures end and tenants have to pay rent owed. So for that reason, and just the fact that the massive unemployment rates and limited government aid, which the other presenters have covered in detail, when the rule is withdrawn and the moratorium lifts, we expect this massive eviction crisis. And if we allow the evictions to simply start again without any long-term assistance, it's going to have a devastating impact on renters and in particular communities of color, right? So for that reason, Western Center, we're co-sponsoring legislation, Assembly Bill 1436, which is called the COVID-19 Eviction Prevention and Housing Stability Act. At core, this legislation is designed to give tenants a fair chance to pay back rent owed and preserve the ability of landlords to pursue unpaid rent through civil actions as opposed through the eviction process, which is currently the case for unpaid rent that is more than a year old. It also contains protections for renters from negative impacts to credit and therefore the ability to rent in the future. So this legislation is a chance for communities. AB 1436 is a chance for communities and individuals to tell their state legislators here in California to stop the looming wave of evictions to keep us all safe and housed. It is, I want to stress, the first step of many that we need to take to bring more equity into housing in California. but this is a great way for people to become engaged. And I also want to touch on, the fact that renters groups have been forming. Emily mentioned renters unions, tenant unions. These are important ways for people to basically important ways to create people power to advocate for tenants, which is again more important than ever. And with that, I'll take any questions.
So Joaquil Hernandez had a question for you, Nisha. We'll start with him.
Sure.
Joaquil, are you on? Right, then we'll move on to Araceli. Araceli, are you on?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, please ask your question.
Nisha, we have heard that despite this eviction moratorium, there has been some eviction or attempts to evict tenants during the pandemic. By any chance, do you have numbers about these evictions since California declared the state of emergency due to the COVID-19? And do you think that AB 1436 is going to pass? What are the challenges? Because we are very close to the end of the legislative year. And a last question is that is allowed to increase rental rents during these times?
Yeah, okay, great, thanks. So your first question with respect to numbers regarding attempts to evict, I don't have numbers right now. I mean, obviously the situation is very fluid and happening very quickly. However, we are hearing the anecdotal stories about how widespread this problem is from our legal services partners in the various cities and counties throughout Los Angeles. We know that this is not an insignificant problem. And the attempts to evict are both the kind of legal attempts to evict and, as I mentioned, the illegal attempts to evict, the changing the locks or trying to call the police or do some other kind of engage in some kind of forcible behavior to get tenants to vacate. Regarding 1436, I think at the California legislature, the legislators are well aware of the need to address this crisis head on. And for that reason, I think that's, yes, there is very little time left in the legislative session, but I think that the legislators are looking very, very closely at 1436 and other proposals to be able to stave off this crisis or at least mitigate it. And then with respect to rents increasing, so it kind of depends on cities and counties. There are, and just kind of patchworks of protections. For example, Los Angeles City has passed a rent freeze for any rent stabilized or rent control housing. And so the rent freeze doesn't mean that the tenant isn't obligated to pay rent. A rent freeze means a rental increase freeze. So, again, it's very dependent on the tenant's individual circumstances. And for that reason, we urge people to contact their local legal aid or legal services programs in order to get information that's tailored to their specific circumstances.
Thank you. Henrietta and Frank, you both had questions for Dr. Kushel that I believe Nisha is equally able to answer. Henrietta, could you ask your question?
Yes, thanks so much, Sunita.
Of
Given
course.
the hardship that people are facing now and the economic difficulties, has there been an increase in illicit activities like drug dealing, prostitution, that people are turning to pay their expenses?
I haven't heard reports about that. I mean, what we do know is that people are becoming increasingly desperate in these times to be able to keep a roof over their heads or to keep themselves, and their families fed. And so that just underscores the importance for there to be meaningful financial and rental assistance, and from the federal government to the state government to local jurisdictions.
And Frank.
Yeah, so my question was for Margot. Do you have statistics for homeless rates within Indigenous and Native American communities? And do you see a rise in homelessness for Indigenous communities that maybe only speak an Indigenous language and are not fluent in English or Spanish?
I'm going to pass that question to Margot.
Margot, are you still on the call?
I am, yes. So we know that Indigenous Americans are overrepresented by a factor of about 8 in the homeless population. So compared to their presence in the population in the US, the numbers who are homeless are about 8-fold. I would say that for urban Indigenous populations, that winds up looking a lot like other homeless populations in urban areas. It's just at a dramatically elevated rate. In rural areas, it often is more hidden because it's not, it's sort of people living in garages or substandard, really, vehicles or other substandard places. And I think that our concerns are with the current pandemic, all of the initial already horrific disparities are just going to increase. I think there is less known about populations who, let's say, who might not speak, who speak other languages. I would be afraid that they would be less likely to be served or even captured in any formal statistic because they're kind of left out. But Indigenous Americans actually have the highest disparity in terms of disproportionate presentation in the homeless population, and it's about an 8-fold increase.
Thank you, Nisha, and thank you, Dr. Kushel, again. We're going to move on to Akash Kalia, who has a really incredible story about turning his father's motel into a shelter for the homeless population. Akash, welcome.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. So yeah, as Sunita mentioned, I had purchased my parents' old hotel in 2012, and I ran it as a hotel for a number of years. I was in my early 20s, working 12 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I was like, you know what? I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. What can I do that has a social impact, but being a small business owner can also maintain the business viability, as I have a mortgage to pay and a family to support. And so in 2015, I converted our 104-unit motel into permanent supportive housing for formerly homeless veterans and chronically homeless civilians. And we've been running ever since, and it's been incredibly successful, not only in our outcomes, but also on a financial basis for our local community, because in Sonoma County, where we're based, the average chronically homeless individual costs our continuum of care, our community, between $80,000 and $180,000 per person per year to do nothing. That's based on law enforcement interaction, inpatient hospitalization, uses of crisis services, and at the Palms, it costs our local community $13,000 per person per year to house them with all of the robust services that we have on site. And so we have a food distribution that comes weekly. We have a mobile health clinic that comes. We have, guitar sessions. We have 12 AA, NA meetings weekly. And it's really about all of these robust services. It's the only thing that maintains housing for this very vulnerable population. It's really easy to put somebody in housing. It's very difficult for them to be able to maintain their housing. And we've been really fortunate that we've had, thus far, we have a 96% success rate in people maintaining their housing. And so around kind of COVID and our current economic situation, specifically in the hospitality industry, hotel owners are hit extremely hard at the moment. And there's been a lot of resources that are now have been allocated with a few different programs from the governor's office with Project Room Key and now Project Home Key, where we have a significant amount of resources. People are realizing that especially in, in the Bay Area and in Northern California, it's extremely hard and expensive to build housing, affordable housing, and specifically permanent supportive housing. And they're now realizing that we're able to, if we can take these, using this PALMS model of hotel conversions, motel conversions, we're able to very quickly house a very vulnerable population. And so that's been incredible to see that this has really gained support. One of the concerns is that although there is a significant amount of money that's coming down the pipeline for, cities and counties to actually purchase properties to convert into permanent supportive housing, the thing that we need to really advocate is for the funding for those supportive services, because that is the only thing that maintains that housing for this vulnerable population. And I really do feel like, the hotel owners in California at the moment, they have the ability to really have an option to salvage their livelihoods by really accepting this model and essentially pivoting, because none of us know how long the hospitality industry is going to be hit. And this is a way for those hotel owners to maintain their business viability and also provide a social good for our most vulnerable population. And so that's why, since doing the PALMS model, I've created a consulting company to help replicate this model and explain to other hotel owners, this is a viable option for you. And I think we're really fortunate to have kind of on a statewide level, the political will to help facilitate these conversions. There's been a few different things that have come down. There's now a CEQA exemption in California for specifically motel conversions into permanent supportive housing, and along with the funding that is coming now from the state to help facilitate. My biggest concern is around making sure that these local governments and the private owners have the sufficient funding available for those supportive services, because oftentimes there's a huge gap in that regard. For example, the housing subsidies that we use to house the veterans, it's called a VASH voucher, and the beauty behind the VASH voucher is that not only is the subsidy for the rental assistance for the individual, but it also comes with the funding for those supportive services that is incredibly needed to maintain that housing. Unfortunately, with the civilians, there is no such kind of dual voucher where it pays for the subsidy, but then it also pays for those wraparound supportive services. So that's where a lot of these developments, a lot of these permanent supportive housing and affordable housing developments that use that are housing a very vulnerable population, a big gap oftentimes is those supportive services, which is just as important as the rental subsidies.
Akash, what have some of the challenges been in, you offer support services, and I imagine that you deal with a lot of extremely complex, both mental health and physical health issues. What have some of those challenges been, and how have you addressed them?
Definitely. I think one of the biggest challenge has been the mental health component of it, is having those mental health professionals on site. And unfortunately, our mental health system in its entirety in this country and even locally is severely lacking. And having the professional help, there's a difference between having a case manager, a housing stabilizer, to an LCSW or a mental health professional with that clinical training. And that has really been one of the most difficult things, is to bring those services on site, because locally we have the ability to call out for crisis intervention services, but because they're so small staffed and such, there's not enough funding there. Basically, ideally what we would like to have in what I would like to have in all permanent supportive housing developments is a mental health professional on site regularly. And that it's when you have to call out for a crisis intervention, I feel like it's gotten too far. And I think that can be significantly reduce the amount of trauma, not only for that resident, but how that crisis creates trauma for all the other residents as well. And so if you have somebody on site, you're able to deal with those situations in a much faster way.
So how has Project Home Key impacted your ability to provide services, and how can other hotel and motel owners tap into those funds?
Yeah, it's been it's very early on. And so it's unfortunately, Project Home Key is only available for public entities. So it's for basically the cities and the counties to go out and purchase properties. I think that it will be successful in the way that there will be communities that are able to purchase these motels and then contract out with the service providers to do the on-site supervision and support services. But from the hotel owner's perspective, from their being able, rather than just selling your property, unfortunately, Project Home Key is not one of those funding sources, from my understanding of the way it's written right now. I don't know if there's an option for the different local governments to use those funds as essentially like a master lease service. I'm not sure if that's allowed, but if that is allowed, then that's really what I see as a much scalable, much larger. You can scale that much larger than you can with just purchasing properties, because that money is finite and the amount of properties that you're going to be able to purchase is finite. But if you're able to create a business model for hotel owners to still maintain their business viability with a master lease or something like that, I can see that having a much larger impact.
Absolutely. Henrietta, you have a question.
Clientele. So has there been an increase in your upkeep costs for maintenance and other type of services that would be geared towards the homeless in terms of maintaining the property?
There is in certain regards, I think, and are you asking in regards from running a hotel compared to running permanent supportive housing?
Yes, exactly. You're running it rather than for regular hotel clients. You're now running it for homeless clients. So what effect has that had on your costs in terms of maintenance and upkeep?
Sure. I think so. There has been in different ways costs have gone up, but in other ways costs have gone down. One of those ways is where one significant way is, there's running a hotel it's a very intensive, constant, your payroll is a lot higher when you're running a hotel because you have a lot more staff. With our population that we're housing, that's kind of one of those, with those maintenance costs that you were talking about, one of those biggest ways to reduce those is having those intensive case management services on site. Because, for example, one of the ways that we help reduce those costs is by all the case managers check in with their clients weekly in their home. So they get eyes on the unit and say, does this person have a leaky faucet? Is a unit starting to get in a way that we need to address in regards to, do they need to take their trash out or things like that? And the actual case manager will help that client work on those things so we can deal with those maintenance things on the front end, rather than if we find out about it a month later or before the problem gets too bad. So that's one way that we help reduce those costs, and it's very effective.
Fantastic. Sandy.
I just wanted to say what a remarkable panel of speakers. And what I'm taking away from this is that we did the typical journalist sort of literary license using the metaphor of a tsunami. And it did make it feel inevitable. And the theme from all the speakers is that this is a human-made crisis and there's nothing inevitable about it. So much as I love the metaphor of the tsunami, I'm not going to use it in our write-up of this extraordinary briefing. And that's really a tribute to the speakers. And thank you so much. You all gave us a sense of what can be done, not just to mitigate, but to transform. So Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us again. Have a good week.